Okay, so I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Linda Birkin for her actual second entoLIVE. And Linda's going to talk to us about a fantastic citizen science project and the work of the Buzz Club to do with ecosystem services at a garden scale. So over to you, Linda.
Lovely. Let me just oop my timer. Right. Hello, folks. As Kieran says, I am Dr. Linda Birkin, and I'm going to be talking about ecosystem services at a garden scale. So a little bit of intro. I've seen some quite familiar faces popping into the chat, but I work for the Buzz Club. It is a citizen science organisation based out of Sussex University, and we focus on doing projects in gardens looking at elements of wildlife gardening or garden invertebrates. And the reason we do so much citizen science-based things is if you're going to go and do something slightly weird in a garden in the name of science, it is best if the person who owns the garden goes to do it, because it is much less problematic for you to go out in your garden and do something strange than for me to try to come into every garden. So we really do rely on that collaboration between gardeners and scientists and the insects as well. So why gardens? Like, gardens are hugely diverse. There are as many different ways to garden as there are gardeners themselves. So you might be managing your garden for flowers. You might be a really keen vegetable grower. You might be growing it for, you might be managing it specifically for wildlife, or you might just be having somewhere, to have a nice chill cup of tea in a bit later. There is huge variety on life and creatures and wildlife in gardens. But no matter the size of the gardens are all going to relate to each other in some way. They're all part of this ecological mosaic of all the different habitats and all the little different parcels of land that are all present in that wider environment and all subject to the ecosystem processes happening around you. So some of these things are going to be helping the garden, some of them are going to be maybe hindering some of the things you're trying to do, and your own garden itself will be contributing back to those things. So it's actually a very good way of feeling more connected with the natural world around you is to get out there, do some gardening, and seeing how what you do affects what is happening out there. So making it so that wildlife isn't just something that happens far away in a wildlife site, that these things are actually where you live as well. So last bit of making sure we're all on the same page. Ecosystem services. What are ecosystem services? Broadly, ecosystem services is a way of trying to conceptualize the benefits that humans get from the natural world and from ecosystems that might be occurring on a scale that is otherwise kind of hard to describe. And so much so that like the ecosystem services, occurring on global scales, on massive landscape scales. And it kind of means that when things are so large, are happening on such a large scale, they can be missed, particularly if you are thinking about decisions that you want to make that are on a big scale, maybe like, on terms of a hillside or a town, but are not being taken with that wider wider set of things that might be happening into account. And so you can actually kind of miss all the value that you might be impeding by one thing that you've done. So ecosystem services is a way to try and describe all those wider benefits that we receive. So they're broadly separated. We don't need to know a huge amount about this because I'm going to be going down to ecosystem services at quite a small scale. But when we're considering it big scale, they're broadly separated into provisioning services, which is the sort of goods that you directly use. So like food, water, other resources, supporting services, which are the sort of ecological processes that is making the world and the environment exist. So like water cycling, soil formation, all those kind of things. Regulating services are then the things that are acting on the supporting services on the wider landscape that produce the characteristics of that place. So pollination and pest control, which I'm going to be focusing on quite a lot in this talk, tend to come under that. Like, the pollination is going to be provided by the creatures that are there. So what pollination is available will differ depending on where you are, and that produces a different overall outcome, etc. And then headphones are falling off. Cultural services is where you are trying to describe the sort of benefits that humans get from the environment that is less extractive, that are more kind of less a tangible thing. So more sort of about education or inspiration or that kind of thing. It can be a little bit of a bucket, and not all ways of describing ecosystem services necessarily include cultural, but it is one of the ways of like understanding that there are other things that aren't like physically things you can see that we might be benefiting from. So why use this sort of concept? I've already said a bunch of caveats, I'm going to say a bunch more. So why do we need something like ecosystem services? It is useful to be able to describe these large scale processes in relation to decisions that are made, so like policy decisions or like landscape management decisions. For example, like if the decision you're making is, I would like a lot of timber, I will take all those trees over there and I will remove them and I will get the timber. Like there's a big benefit to that. It's an extraction, it's timber that's needed for a whole lot of things. But if you are not taking into account the wider set of things that those trees are doing, you might run into problems. Like that timber may actually be holding all the soil on the hillside. It may be contributing significantly to how the landscape is working in terms of the water resources and how water is moving through the landscape. So you could end up with a situation where, you know, the person who is, or the decision that's been made for take all the trees off, it's like, brilliant, we got a lot of resources, that was good, and has actually then turned out to, on a wider scale, cost more in needing to stick the soil back on, needing to deal with all the flooding that's now happening because the local rivers have got full of silt, and you could end up in a spiral of things that you hadn't thought of and hadn't taken into account because there may not be a way to take them into account in the decision-making framework that you're using. So it's trying to bring some of these big scale ecosystem processes into decisions that are being made, so hopefully better decisions are made. There is debate over this approach of whether it is the best way to do it. It doesn't really include any like intrinsic value of things exist and they're allowed to, isn't really part of it. It's very focused on humans, it's very anthropocentric, it's very extractive, it's very like, what is the benefit that we get? And there are quite a lot of unknowns because we do not have perfect understanding of how ecosystem processes work. We are getting better every time somebody discovers a new way in which one thing interacts with another thing. It improves those models, it improves the decision-making process. So it is getting better, but there are weaknesses in it. So I've been talking about that at this large scale, and it was originally come up with very much in relation to large scale decisions. So why am I doing a talk about ecosystem services at a garden scale? Because it is important. These ecological processes exist at multiple scales. The impact of them might be different, and like the overall volume of stuff produced or cycled or whatever may be a lot smaller, but they still exist, and it can be useful to look at it on a smaller scale to be able to understand what's going on at a larger one. And I also mentioned before that gardens are very helpful for helping us to feel more connected to the natural world, or at least to reduce our disconnection. A lot of the way that our society is set up, or the way that, you know, towns and cities and things are set up, it's quite easy to end up in a situation where you do not feel like you are part of nature, like nature is something that happens away from you. And that is not true. And recognizing how these processes affect small enough scale as your back garden can help you understand why you should care about them at a larger scale and what we can do to help with that. This is easier to do with some processes than others, and pollination and pest control, which is the ones that I'm mostly going to be talking about, are quite comparatively easy to do, and also within our remit as people who are interested in insects. It's not just insects, of course. There is work. I just wanted to point out some other sort of local scale ecosystem service work that's done before I go on to ours. So there are other invertebrate things. There are like other citizen science projects looking at other invertebrates. So Earthworm Watch is a really good example. That was a citizen science project looking at earthworms. Earthworms are massively important to nutrient cycling, massively important to the quality of soil. And then the quality of your soil also reflects out a lot of other things. If your soil is extremely compacted and bad for worms, it is also going to start causing you flooding problems. It is going to be hard to grow things on, and so on and so forth. And all these little different processes connect together. And one of the ways in which you can get an idea of what's going on with your soil is to look at what of the critters are in there, what the earthworms are doing. So that was a pretty fun one for that. Street trees are one that often pops up quite a bit when you're thinking about ecosystem services in towns, because trees on streets can have an impact on quite a lot of different physical elements of town. So they cool streets quite significantly because of the canopy. You know, a tree canopy is meant to intercept a lot of sunlight. And if it intercepts a lot of sunlight as a tree, it is not immediately just hitting the concrete and baking the cars. Similarly, it slows down rainfall, and the tree itself will then take water back up into the leaves, so you can reduce the risk of flash flooding in areas with quite a lot of sealed surfaces if you unseal the surfaces and put trees on it. Air filtration is another one of those that is quite associated with plants in towns. This was a study from University of Cambridge that was looking at how just hedges around school playing fields, well, school car park playing areas, were really useful at reducing the amount of particulates, air pollution that was coming off roads. So you're getting, again, the interplay between these ecosystem processes and the benefits that we want, or even just the reduction of the negatives that we don't want. So onto the level of ecosystem services we deal with. Insect system services was the closest I could get to a pun, because I did promise Kieran I would limit the bee puns. So these are the sort of ones that we look at. And as I said before, the Buzz Club focuses on insects in gardens and wildlife-friendly gardening methods. And pollination and pest control are closely tied to gardening and close to the heart of many gardeners. Both are quite dependent on insects. Particularly in the case of pest control, two sides of the same coin often, that there are insects that are helping with your pest control and insects that are the things that you might want to be controlling. But they're both things that you can see effects of in gardens. You can see successful pollination, you can see problems when you don't have enough pollination, and you can definitely see the pests. So there's something that is, well, they're an ecosystem service that is quite well suited to the type of experimental manipulation that we do. So I'm going to talk first about pest control, then about pollination in regards to my PhD, and then pollination in regards to current Buzz Club projects. Although current Buzz Club projects will be sprinkled all the way through it. So let's move on to those. Pest control, huge part of gardening, often a very part of more ecologically friendly gardening as well, because one of the first things you can do to be more ecologically friendly in your gardening is to throw away all your pesticides. But it's still a big concern. So how, if you've binned off all your pesticides, well, how do you now achieve your gardening goals if you are particularly being beset by things that want to eat your delicious vegetables? There are obviously kind of like ways that you can do this and things that you can support. It can be a bit of a difficult one to do experiments on. It's fairly easy to observe if there are pests in your garden. It is a little harder to observe if they are actually being controlled by other invertebrates. It can be a bit hard to test. For pollination, which I say I'm going to come on to, there is a relatively easy way to do a pollination test of, you have two flowers, you put a bag on one of them so the pollinators can't get in. This is going to give you an idea of how much pollination is being provided when the pollinators can get in. For pest control, physically putting a bag on something is also a pest control, or you are just keeping all of the pests in one place and excluding the controllers. It is harder to have a kind of like default method of doing this. So the Buzz Club actually doesn't currently have a project that is specifically focused on assessing the provision of pest control. I would quite like to do something about that, but we're working on coming up with some ideas. We have got quite a few of our projects will be providing habitat or resources for natural enemies, for the type of insects that are on your side. They're natural enemies of aphids, not natural enemies of you. They are the ones that are essentially working with you, the ones that are doing the things that you want them to do in the garden, on the more killing off of the pest side of things. And we do a lot of education, we do a lot of advice on supporting these things and making a more robust ecological system within the garden that supports a broader array of critters, so more of the ones that do what you want. So, for example, we've got a couple of bee hotel projects going on at the moment, Airbnb and the Big Bee Hotel Experiment, which I realize I've put the acronym for on the wrong slide, but never mind. These are providing hotels, so bee hotels, which are for solitary bees. They are also for solitary wasps. Some solitary wasps like them as well. And bees, go into the tubes of the bee hotel, make a little cell, either leaves or mud or whatever it is that they use, pack it full of pollen, stick an egg on it, seal it off, do the rest all the way down. Solitary wasps do the same thing, but solitary wasps are not vegetarian. So solitary wasps will provision their nest with prey. This prey is often caterpillars. They've got to get the caterpillars from somewhere. The shortest distance is best. If you have solitary wasps in your bee hotel, they are going to be collecting caterpillars from your garden. the caterpillars will therefore not be eating things in your garden. It is, again, a bit difficult to tell, bit difficult to test how they're doing it, or like what effect this is necessarily having, but you can see a whole tube full of caterpillars. That is a lot of caterpillars that have not been eating your vegetables. They're clearly doing something. I would like to look more into these solitary wasps, but at the moment we're just kind of noting that they're there and that it is interesting and cool. We've got a couple of projects going on with some other insects that do biological control as well. Ladybirds, often thought of as the king of biological control. The larvae eat aphids, the adults eat aphids. They live for quite a long time. They're very charismatic. Who doesn't like a ladybird? We've got a little snapshot observation project on ladybirds, and we also have one looking at ladybird overwintering habitat. So not just what do the ladybirds need while they're in the garden actively eating the aphids, but are there things that you can do to help them be all nice and cozy over winter, and therefore being available as soon as possible come the spring. We also have a project called Here We Go, which I have named. You might be able to tell that from the name. And this is looking at earwigs, which can be both sides of the pest control coin. They can nibble on your plants and on the soft petals of things, but they can also eat quite a lot of aphids. They are omnivores. So the idea behind the Here We Go project is to try and find a way of persuading or physically moving the earwigs to go from the part of the garden where they are not providing pest control and are being the opposite, to on a tree, for example, where they are actually doing the thing that you would want them to do. So can you do an intervention to help that and also the education about earwigs, because they're fascinating little insects. So we've done habitats for natural enemies, but habitat isn't just nesting habitat or overwintering habitat, it's also food, it's wider food. Janine Griffiths-Lee, Dr. Jean Griffiths-Lee, who is part of the Buzz Club, she is going to do an entoLIVE, I believe, on this project, so I will not go into too much detail on it, but she did a project when she was at Sussex that was looking at planting mini meadows in gardens to improve the amount of floral diversity, the amount of wildflowers that are present in gardens. And this is really important because a lot of solitary wasps, a lot of these things that do provide some of this pest control, they don't eat solid food as an adult. That extremely snatched wasp waste doesn't tend to let actual solid food down it. So many of them are very reliant on there being nectar around for the sugary boost to fly, because it's quite tiring to be a wasp. So they need to have access to those resources. So if you're providing those resources before they need them, so you're making sure that your garden is a nice place for all these little tiny wasps to get themselves established, that when you then have an aphid infestation, or you have something else going on, or you like the top right one there is a wasp that parasitizes large white butterfly caterpillars. If once you have a lot of those things that they can actually attack, they will be raring and ready to go. So Janine's project was showing that planting these improved amount of wildflowers greatly increased the abundance of solitary wasps that were being found in those gardens. So it's clearly doing something useful for this whole class of insects that provides pest control. Like, we can't necessarily say that they are definitely doing it because it's hard to measure it like that, but there's a lot of them and they will be doing wasp things. Some of the other planting things that we do, this is a bit more on the educational side of things in terms of supporting natural enemies. Wonderful weeds, learning to love your weeds. A lot of weeds are just wildflowers with attitude. This is my garden and my cat for scale. My garden likes to grow massive thistles. So if it's not in the middle of a path, I leave it there because you get aphids on them. Oh, hello. Oh. Is that hello?
That was me by accident. Sorry.
Oh, that was you by accident. I was about to say, have I frozen? No worries. Yeah, so you growing your weeds, they will get aphids on them, they will get things on them earlier than everything else, because weeds or plants that we consider to be weeds tend to get going ASAP as soon as the weather is good enough for them to do so. And they support ladybirds, they support anything that wants to pollinate a thistle flower, which provides a lot of pollen and nectar resources. I love me a giant thistle. We also have the example there of Dave's bolted BBC parsnip. This is a little still from when Dave was talking about his massive parsnip plant on the BBC. But the point of this part is when your vegetable plants or your herbs or your leaf crops bolt and produce flowers, those flowers can actually be very, very useful for supporting natural enemies, particularly tiny wasps. So don't necessarily view them as, oh no, I'm no longer getting cabbage. You may not be getting cabbage, but you are now producing wasps that will protect your next set of cabbages. So there's that connectivity in the thinking. So I'm going to zoom on from this. So this was just another emphasis on managing for natural enemies. If this essentially involves holding your nerve, it will take longer for a population of natural enemies, a population of pest control insects, to build up to a level where they will properly clobber the pests, but they will be doing it in a much more sustainable way than if you use like an insecticide, which will kill off the larvae of, for example, the hoverflies here, that they have these predatory larvae which eat a lot of aphids, but can be quite hard to see when they're quite small. So you may not notice that they're there. So if you try and clobber the aphids with an insecticide spray, you've actually removed the beneficial invertebrates as well. And the aphids will be back. They're born pregnant. They have already got a head start on absolutely everything. So there's this concept of holding your nerve. Just let it be a bit pesty for a couple of weeks, and then see if the natural enemies have turned up. So pollination, we've talked a bit about pest control in that regard. Pollination as an ecosystem service is one of those ones that is comparatively easy to value, because you can do it based on the crops that you get out of it. So when you see people talking about pollination as an ecosystem service, you get very, very big numbers, like $200 billion per year for, I can't remember what year that was in, but a relatively recent one. That is a massive amount. 80% of crops grown in the EU need some animal mediated pollination. Not if you're a grain, most of those are wind pollinated, but a lot of things need at least some pollination in order to produce a good crop. And this, obviously, garden plants are very similar to crop plants. Crop plants just grown on a bigger scale, so they do also need pollination. It varies depending on the plant, depending on the crop, but it is a very demonstrable service being provided by bugs in your garden. And it is a little easier to study than pest control. As I said, you could do exclusion experiments relatively easily. And you can also come the other way, where you look at the final yield and work out how much pollination was needed to get there, and therefore how much pollination must be being provided in the space. So I'm going to cover two things that look at both of those methods. And yeah, habitat for pollinators, just saying, our existing projects also cover habitat for pollinators. If it covers habitat for natural enemies, it'll also be habitat for pollinators. So the bee hotel experiments, solitary bees, wonderful pollinator. The other one is a hoverfly lagoons. Dr. Ellen Rotheray, this is her baby, her project, and she's done an ENTOLIVE. So if you want more details on this, it's on the YouTube channel. But this is adding in a type of habitat that you may not have, because this sort of hoverfly doesn't have predatory larvae. It has larvae with like a long snorkel tail. So they live in little shallow ponds full of rotting leaves. Most gardens don't have little rotting leaf ponds. So adding in a deliberate lagoon to improve the breeding habitat for those hoverflies is an intervention that you can do to improve your pollination, and so on and so forth. And the same planting advice works for pollinators as it does for natural enemies. If you want the pollinators to be absolutely ready and raring to go when they need to pollinate your crops, it's helpful if they're already in your garden doing what they need to do. So when I was talking about pollination exclusion, this is the kind of experiment I mean. So Bees and Beans was one of the cornerstone projects of my PhD, which came sort of before the Buzz Club. Things I've learned from this project, I brought over into the Buzz Club when we were setting it up. This was a citizen science project. I was getting folks to grow dwarf broadbean plants, 3 plants, one open to the efforts of local pollinators, one hand pollinated by just wobbling the flowers, and then one of them was bagged to exclude any pollinators. And the idea behind this, firstly, was to see if this sort of style of more experimental citizen science projects worked, because at the time this was one of the only citizen science projects that was actually getting people to go out and do an experiment, to do a manipulation in their garden, rather than the tendency to be more observational citizen science projects. This was go and do a thing. And the idea was sort of like, could you use this as a basis of a monitoring scheme? Like if you had a lot of sentinel gardens doing this kind of thing, could you show if there was a loss of pollination? Because if you compare the yield to the local plant, which gets whatever the local pollinators are doing, to the hand pollinated plant, which should be maximum pollination, and the bagged plant, which should be no pollination, you can get an idea of what's actually going on in that space. And it was pretty popular. We got, well, I say we, because I'm used to the buzz club. I got 100 volunteers across the 3 years. People liked doing it. It was most reliable using gardeners. And this is one of the reasons why we focus on gardens for the Buzz Club. I actually, in the first year, had a slightly weird result that was all of the yields of pods and beans from the bean plants were higher in gardens that were also growing other broad beans, which might make sense to the open plants, which you might have some cross-pollination, but definitely doesn't make sense for cross-pollination in plants that have a bag on them. So it turned out that gardeners were better at growing broad bean plants in general than people who had never grown broad bean plants before, which may seem a little bit obvious, but often this is how science works. So after that point, we focused specifically on gardeners, and also it's easier because people with gardens tend to have more space to do the citizen science. I was absolutely very, very appreciative of the people who took part in that first year and were doing the project on balconies, like in car parking spaces or in other slightly strange places. It is overall easier when you are running a project if everyone has a garden, because things don't get run over or destroyed by pigeons, which did happen. The feedback from the people taking part in this project was actually very positive. Obviously, a lot of people were gardeners and did understand that pollination was a thing and that pollination was needed. But doing a manipulation experiment brings home how much it works, how much it happens. You can see the change of when you are keeping the pollinators out. You can see that this is definitely going on in your garden space, and it allows you to have a better connection with the concept of that ecosystem process. And people really did like that. We did publish it. I can just go past this slide so we make sure we have enough time. Basically, publish it on the basis of the first year data. And as you can see, if you put a bag on it, it doesn't get pollinated. It's a little bit like the subtitle of my PhD. But more important was more how people found the project and what people liked about the projects, and how this type of project allows you to ask questions that are a little more complicated than maybe just an observational one. So this is, we're now moving on to the other end of pollination, where rather than trying to measure how much pollination has happened on a specific plant or set of plants, you are looking at the yield and then working out how much pollination must have been needed for that to happen. So presumably this is the way in which that sort of $200 billion a year pollination as a massive global ecosystem service thing is calculated. This is a little bit more personal. So this is another one of my PhD projects that has moved over into the Buzz Club. And the idea behind this is that people like growing food. Growing food is a really important part of gardening for a lot of people, for a lot of reasons. A lot of these reasons are not necessarily just about the food. There's a lot of things about, mental health benefits, exercise benefits, satisfaction, being able to grow things you couldn't buy in a shop, and so on and so forth. There are quite a lot of reasons why you might grow your own food. But either way, the outcome is food has been grown, and it is good when it is successful. So different crops have different needs for insect pollination in order to achieve that. For example, apples have very heavy pollen, it's sticky, and the flowers don't self very well. So to get an apple, you need to take pollen from one flower to another flower, generally on the bottom of an insect. So apples, really high need for insect pollination. If you are growing lettuce and root vegetables, for example, somewhat lower need for insect pollination. Maybe if you're growing them for seed, but you're probably not doing that if you're in the UK. So there is different needs for pollination amongst different vegetables, different crops. And I wanted to look at this in a different way than just kind of going, you have a high need for pollination or you have a low one. I wanted to look at a more, I don't necessarily want to say more impactful, but something that comes from a different way. So I went with money. The idea behind this project, which became the garden shop calculator, which I will say, going to go a bit more detail, but it was working out how much it would have cost you to buy your yields in a shop being Waitrose organic, or other organic if necessary, and then comparing that to known requirements for those crops for insect pollination, which was a big literature search for when things have been looked into. Because you can do like really detailed experiments to see how much pollen needs to be transferred from one plant to another, using manually doing it and all that kind of thing to figure out what the need for that pollination is. But if I was trying to do that afresh for every crop that everyone's growing in the gardens, I'd still be doing the research. So as it was, I did a big literature review to try and find out where that was, where in agriculture that had been looked up. So I ended up with a database of pollination requirements for UK crops, a list of those things, and a beautiful spreadsheet. I think it's beautiful. It is a spreadsheet. Your mileage might vary on how much you like a spreadsheet. I like a spreadsheet. The idea behind this garden shop calculator is that you weigh or record your yield, pop it in the spreadsheet, and it will calculate how much it would have cost you to buy it in a shop, what proportion of that is directly a result of insect pollination based on the pollination requirement, and it will then calculate the value of the pollination that's happened in your garden by those insects. It spits out a little report at the bottom. And the version we have for the Buzz Club has a few more slightly esoteric categories than just weight and number, because when you're working with gardens and allotments and things, people do not necessarily have the ability to weigh their crops immediately. So I also have handful, mugful, and approximate supermarket portion. And the weight of individual items involved a lot of me just weighing things from shops. A bit strange, but we do what we must. And yeah, so that gives you an idea of like the value of the effort of your local bugs. So this is just a quick example of, this is a harvest recently taken from one of the local allotments I do work with. If you were growing garlic and beetroot primarily, not a huge amount of pollination needed. Squashes, quite a lot. So you'd get the majority of the supermarket value for that squash would be recorded as a result of bee activity, not so much for the other two. Use this calculator in several projects. So I used it in my PhD. Dr. Beth Nichols, who I think has done an ENTOLIVE on the project that this was part of, also used it in a project that she did on urban gardening. And since 2020, it's been part of the Buzz Club as well. This is not the most helpful table because, as you will notice, the average, which is the average per garden taking part in the project, how much they've earned that year, has been consistently going up quite a lot. But this is because I update the spreadsheet each year with the current value of crops. So it's just kind of going up as inflation and cost of living go up. The more useful part of the column is the percentage of the harvest that's due to bees, like how that varies around. Depending on the year, like there will be fluctuation based on who's taken part, what they primarily grow, whether or not an orchard is involved, and that kind of thing. But it does seem to gone quite well, and is highlighting something quite interesting, is that for UK gardens and UK growing, there seems to be 50 to 60%. So like a good half of the success of the growing of the food and the fruit and the vegetables is reliant on insect pollination. It's worth making the effort because it's a really big contributor to success. And feedback from participants of the project has been very positive. People have, if they have liked doing the project, it's one of those projects that we kind of need to find a bit of a home for, because it does require you to be happy with spreadsheets and obsessive about weighing your vegetables. If you like those things, you will probably really like the project. One of my favorite bits of feedback I got for it was, oh, the bees have paid for our allotment. Because the value of the directly contributed to by insect pollination from one set of folks was more than it cost them in the year to rent the allotment. So the bees are sort of paying rent. And I'm really pleased with this because it's very much able to change the discussion from looking after the bees to looking after your bees. It's looking after these things that are working in partnership with you. It is an ecological process, an ecosystem service that is happening at a scale that you can demonstrate by having a better yield of tomatoes. So when you are trying to get people to, consider doing things like stopping using other pesticides, or learning to put up with some of those weeds, or planting wildflower meadows, or putting up with things that are a little bit chewed and a little bit aphided to begin with while you're waiting for the natural enemies to kick in, it gives you that sort of tangible reason why you should do this, or why it's a good idea to do this. And it gives you that sort of in-the-pocket demonstration of ecosystem services. It makes them feel a little bit more real, which I'm quite pleased with. I do need to find somewhere to do this project a bit more frequently, but I think it works pretty well for what we try and achieve with it. And that is actually me zooming through this fairly quickly. So thank you very much. As I said, these are mostly Buzz Club projects. If you have liked what I've been talking about and you are interested in taking part in some of these projects or finding out more about what we do, there will be plenty of links from Kieran, because he's great at that. But with the Buzz Club, we're at Sussex. It's free to join. We also have various membership tiers for sponsoring, because we are also fully funded by donations. So if you would like to find out more about what we do, support what we do, check us out. And with that little bit of shameless plugging, I will hand back over to Kieran and take your questions.